Welcome to a deep dive, you guys. We're diving into Juz 5 of the Quran, but going way deeper than just reading. It's like you shared these verses because you're thinking about marriage, family stuff, inheritance, even social stuff, right? Like, how does it all connect to justice?
Yeah, definitely.
So that's our focus. And right off the bat, verses 21 through 24, they laid down the law, like literally, on marriage. Prohibited marriages. There's even this whole solemn covenant thing. What's the deal with those rules, especially back then?
It's really interesting, it wasn't just about like new rules. This was a direct challenge to what was already happening in pre-Islamic Arabia. Back then, marrying your close relative or even like your dad's widow, that was seen as normal.
Wow, really?
These prohibitions were meant to create a whole new ethical way of looking at marriage. It was about making it a sacred bond between people who were equal.
So it's like these verses that we were setting the stage for a fairer society, starting with families, right?
Exactly.
Okay, but then verse 25 brings up something that's honestly kind of tough to hear today. It's the idea of men marrying, female slaves. How do we even begin to understand that, especially with everything else we're talking about justice and all?
Yeah, you hit on something that we really have to look at in its historical context.
Yeah.
During the time this was revealed, slavery was a brutal reality.
Yeah.
And the Quran, instead of just, instantly getting rid of a system that was so deeply rooted, it tried to reform it. It set limits, ethical guidelines, the phrase they use, those whom your right hands possess, that reflects this reality.
So it's kind of like they knew it was a complex situation, but they were trying to make things better, especially for the most vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. Like even in those situations, the woman had to consent to the marriage. It was mandatory. And the man had to provide a mar, like a dowry, just as he would for a woman who wasn't enslaved. These rules were meant to give them some protection, some agency that just wasn't there before.
That's an important detail. So even in a system that we see as completely wrong today, they were trying to make it more fair, more respectful.
Right.
Okay, switching gears a little. Verses 32 to 34, they talk about the roles of men and women within a family. And we run into this idea of men being in charge of women, which, let's be honest, causes a lot of debate. What are your thoughts on how we should interpret that, especially this idea of kiwama? It's often translated as guardianship, right?
Exactly. And this is a great example of where understanding the nuances of the language in the historical context is so important. Because kiwama doesn't really translate neatly into how we see gender roles today. It's not about men having all the power. It's more about emphasizing their responsibility to financially support and protect their families.
Ah, okay. So it's more about accountability than control.
Exactly. Or imagine like a structure that needs support to stand up. Men, because of their roles back then, they were tasked with being that support. But it wasn't a free pass. It came with obligations towards their wives.
A two-way street.
Exactly.
So it's less about, who's on top and more about understanding that men and women, they need each other within a family.
Precisely.
That's a helpful way to look at it. Reminds us that even things that seem simple can have a lot more to them. And speaking of unpacking things, verse 34, which talks about physical discipline in marriage, that can be a tough one to swallow. It feels so different from this mutual respect and responsibility we've been talking about.
I hear you. If you just look at this verse by itself, it can be really concerning.
Yeah.
But it's so important to understand it presents this as an absolute last resort. Only when every other way to work things out has failed.
So not condoning violence, but more like guidelines for an extreme situation.
Exactly. And even then, there are very clear rules. Hitting in the face, causing injury, that's all completely forbidden. The focus is still on treating your spouse with kindness, respect, and understanding.
It's like you got to remember the context to really get it, especially with something this sensitive. So we've talked about family, but Juz 5, it keeps coming back to this idea of social justice, right? Like in verses 29 through 33 and again in 36, it's all about justice, treating people fairly, supporting those who need it. It's like this constant reminder to build a society based on compassion. What strikes you about how these verses connect how we act personally with this bigger vision of social responsibility?
It's interesting because it's not just about being a good person in this vague sense. There are really specific things it talks about that we can actually do to make a difference. Taking care of orphans, helping those who are struggling, being kind to our neighbors, even people just passing through. It's like a practical guide to putting faith into action.
Yeah, it's saying faith isn't just this private thing. It has to affect how we treat the people and the world around us.
Exactly. And this actually leads into a core concept in Islam called zakat. You might think of it as charity, but it's way more than that. Zakat is about redistributing wealth, like a built-in system for social welfare, making sure everyone in the community has what they need to survive.
So it's about understanding we're all connected and that what one person does affects the whole community.
Exactly. Like that Mar we talked about earlier, right? It was about creating some security for women in that specific situation.
Mhm.
Zakat is like that, but for the entire society.
That's a powerful idea that faith can create this kind of shared responsibility.
It's a beautiful aspect of it.
Okay, now it gets a bit more complicated when we get to verses 75 and then 97 through 99. They talk about people being oppressed and even say it's okay to fight to defend them. This is something that's often misinterpreted, twisted around. How does the Quran square this idea of fighting with everything else we've been talking about justice and compassion?
Right. This is where we have to understand jihad. The word itself often gets translated as holy war, but that's so misleading, even dangerous. Jihad, in its truest sense, is about striving for what's right, struggling for it.
So it's more about the effort towards justice, not just about physical fighting.
Absolutely. And actually, armed conflict that's only allowed in the most extreme situations as a last resort, when everything else has failed and innocent lives are at risk.
So it's not about like going out and conquering or being aggressive, but about protecting those who can't protect themselves, resisting oppression.
Exactly. And even then, there are strict rules about how it's done to minimize harm, make sure it's proportionate, that it upholds justice and compassion. It's fighting for peace, not just more violence.
That's a really important distinction to make, especially today.
For sure.
Now, finally, I want to talk about verses 135 and 136. They're all about honesty, telling the truth, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it goes against what we might personally want. What do you make of that, this unwavering commitment to truth and justice, no matter what?
Those verses, they get to the core of what Islamic morality is all about. They remind us that true faith, it's not just about rituals or beliefs, it's about integrity, being accountable, putting truth above what's easy or personally beneficial, even when it's tough.
So it's about living your values, even when it's a challenge.
Exactly. It's about understanding that a just and compassionate society, it starts with each person choosing those values. It's about realizing that our choices, they have a ripple effect.
It's like it's saying, look in the mirror. Are you really living this? Are you part of making the world a better place?
Exactly. And that's something we should all be thinking about all the time, right? No matter who we are, what we believe, it's like a guidebook for a life with meaning, with ethics.
It's realizing we're all connected to something so much bigger, and even the small things we do can make a difference.
That's it.
So thinking about everything we've talked about in Juz 5, from families to like social justice, taking responsibility, is there one big takeaway you'd want to leave with our listeners? Something they can keep chewing on as they explore these ideas more?
You know, when you step back and look at it all, marriage, family, social justice, personal responsibility, it all comes back to this idea of interconnectedness. It's amazing, really. It's not just a bunch of random rules. It's like these threads that create this whole picture of a just and compassionate world.
So we're not just individuals, we're part of this web, and our lives are woven into the well-being of everyone around us.
Exactly. And these verses, they don't just tell us what to do, they make us want to do it.
Hmm.
They push us to look inside and ask, how can I be a part of making things better, more just, more compassionate?
It's not about checking boxes, it's about the journey, right? Always learning, reflecting, taking action.
You got it. And, you know, one last thought. What we've talked about here, these verses, it's really just the beginning. It's an invitation to go deeper, have these conversations, and figure out how to live by these timeless principles in the world today, even when it's hard.
A conversation that doesn't end here. Thanks for joining us, everyone.